Hello, everyone. My name is Solome Tibabu. I'm the fund director at the Upswing Fund for Adolescent Mental Health, and we're back for another Ask the Expert session. I'm so pleased to have Ami Bishop here with Outright Action International. Thank you so much, Ami, for joining us. Can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, and thank you so much for having me. I'm really honored that Upswing has asked me to participate in this Ask the Expert session. I'm the Senior Research Advisor for Outright Action International. I spent many years before this actually in working in global public health. I'm based here in Seattle and live with my wife, and we have two sons in their 20s. So adolescent mental health and the well-being of adolescents and young adults is important personally to me as well.
Wonderful. And can you tell us a little bit more about your work with Outright Action International?
Sure. So Outright Action International is a 30-year-old global human rights organization focusing on the human rights of LGBTIQ people around the world. We work kind of in three different areas. First of all, we conduct research and documentation, looking at critical issues in the ways that LGBTIQ people around the world face challenges, face discrimination, denied their rights. So we want to document and research those areas so that we have evidence to fuel our advocacy, which is the next area, if you will, is global advocacy. We work very intently at the United Nations level, actually, to try and push the various human rights mechanisms and bodies within the UN to include LGBTIQ human rights within the broader human rights agenda. And then we also focus on resourcing movements around the world. So we provide support, technical assistance, in some cases funding, as we did during the COVID, through our COVID emergency fund, to grassroots movements around the world.
Speaking of advocacy and movements, and what are sexual orientation and gender identity change efforts exactly?
Yeah, so this is kind of a new term that we're using. Most people know sexual orientation, gender identity, and expression change efforts, SOGI change efforts, as so-called conversion therapy. So that is really any attempt to change, to suppress, to alter one's sexual orientation or gender identity or expression, essentially to conform to heteronormative cisgender identities. But we are not using the term conversion therapy on purpose because the term suggests that somehow treatment is needed, for a disorder, and that people can be converted to cisgender, to be cisgender or heterosexual, through some sort of treatment. And neither is true, actually. In fact, so-called conversion therapy, SOGI change efforts, cause deep and lasting harm.
And given your global impact, how do things look differently depending on the culture and the region?
Yeah, so what's interesting. So in 2019, Outright conducted extensive research on the nature and extent of so-called conversion therapy, SOGI change efforts around the world. Part of that work was doing a survey of 500 people from 80 countries. And what we found actually was that efforts to repress, to cure, to change queer identities are happening all over the world. So in some sense, what's kind of remarkable is how much the efforts are the same. Of course, within different cultural and religious and societies, the ways that those practices manifest can be different. Although in many countries, religion was definitely behind the sort of at the root of the practices, often with the blessing or with the support of parents who really truly believed they were somehow helping their children to change. In other parts of the world, for example, in China and parts of the Middle East, parts of the former Soviet Union, it would be more practices occurring in the context of psychological or psychiatric care or medical care. So they do look different, but the ultimate goal is universal, unfortunately.
And what are some other misconceptions about sexual orientation and gender identity that contribute to the use of SOGI change efforts?
Yeah, I mean, sadly, many of the change efforts around the world, including here in the US, are driven by conservative ideologies, religious ideologies often, that consider LGBTIQ people broken, sinful, possessed, even sick, needing to be cured. That's probably the biggest misconception, is that we somehow need fixing. And that there are many other misconceptions that I don't even want to give airtime to, myths and beliefs about LGBTIQ people. But young people really need to know that they are okay as they are, and that science, the scientific community has been very clear on this, that diverse sexual orientations and gender identities are absolutely normal and part of human existence, and do not need to be changed.
And let's talk a little bit more about really the impact on LGBTQ plus youth. Can you discuss more about the impact SOGI change efforts?
Yeah. I mean, sadly, the impact is we're devastating, and there's quite a bit of research out there, largely based out of the U.S. and U.K., but nevertheless, I think we can apply around the world. That for example, there's a study that the Trevor Project put out. Trevor Project is an organization here in the U.S. that focuses on the prevention of suicide among youth, and they found that there was about a 2 to 2.5 times increase in the risk of suicide among LGBTIQ youth who were unfortunately subjected to these practices. There's another study that looks at the importance of family acceptance. And so it compared, it looked at lesbian, bisexual, gay young people who reported high levels of family rejection were actually 8.4 times more likely to report attempting suicide, and almost 6 times more likely to report serious depression. So these are well, I think the harm is well documented. The American Psychological Association did a huge meta-analysis in 2009 that looked at the impacts of so-called conversion therapy. And there again, they were able to attribute all sorts of harms, from not just suicide and depression, but increases in substance abuse, low self-esteem, self-hatred, a lot of really negative, I guess, attributes, if you will, as a result of undergoing so-called conversion therapy.
Just horrible.
Yeah.
And we are proud to partner with organizations like the Trevor Project at the Upswing Fund. Super important work. So what do we do about this? What are some steps we can do to come?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, everywhere in the world, of course, continuing the work to build acceptance, it's really about hearts and minds work. We've come a long way in many communities in the U.S., not everywhere in the U.S., but where we have gained protections. We are, it is no longer acceptable to overtly discriminate. At the same time, in many countries around the world, it's really important actually to note that 68 countries in the world actually still criminalize same-sex relations. So you're talking about contexts where your very self, your identity, is actually a crime. And I mean, in fact, the language of the laws usually has to do with sexual acts, but the impact is that you are, you are criminalized. And so on a global scale, one of the things that we want to focus on is legal reform. And so decriminalization of same-sex relations is a broad area that will hopefully impact all sorts of areas, but that's not enough, because that's on a legal basis, it's important, but it doesn't necessarily change attitudes. Specifically on just one more point about the legal realm, there are only now 5 countries in the world that ban SOGI change efforts. So there's a big push also to have explicit bans against these practices. The US, Canada, Australia, Spain, some other countries have subnational. So like in the US, we have some state bans, maybe around 20 states, I think. They're not necessarily comprehensive, but they send an important signal that these practices are not acceptable. Other areas, certainly in terms of making sure that young people and all queer people have access to affirming care, care from medical and mental health providers that is affirming of their identities, that if they are struggling with their sexuality, that they have a safe place to explore that without any fixed outcome, in mind, that they're given the support to really explore who they are and the feelings associated with that in an affirming way. So one of the things that we're looking at on a global basis is actually working with national level medical and mental health associations. What kinds of policies do they have in place? Have they made statements against these practices as that can be used as sort of a broader advocacy approach? And then, of course, specifically looking at the ways to to work with religious leaders and traditional leaders in all sorts of settings, because our research and other research has definitely shown that conservative religious ideologies, as I said, are really behind a lot of the push for change. Working with families, hugely important. Educating families about the realities of the absolute normalcy of being queer in whatever way that looks like. And then finally, in our work, we're looking at working with the United Nations further. So for example, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on torture and cruel and inhumane and degrading treatment has come out and said these practices essentially constitute torture and inhumane treatment and cannot be allowed. So having at the global level a firm and clear set of statements condemning these practices will also be really important in terms of advocacy going forward.
There's so much work to do, but this is really wonderful to hear how much work has been done. So thank you for highlighting these examples.
Yeah. Could I add just one quick thing? Because I think it's really important to mention that survivors of these practices are really critical to the advocacy and to the work going forward, because they can speak to the realities of what these practices look like, how they've experienced them, and why they need to stop from their own personal experience. And so what we find around the world is it's these very courageous people who have come forward to really lead the efforts in their contexts to end these practices.
That's so important. I love that. Of course, then that's definitely something we embrace with the Upswing Fund, is individuals with lived experience and youth actually at the table. So very important. So Ami, how can others find out more about your work, get in touch with Outright Action International?
Yeah, we love to hear from people. I'm sure we will make available our website when with this recording, and of course I'm available. My contact information is on our website if people want to learn more about the work. We continue to focus on specific areas in terms of advocating against these practices. My colleague in Africa, based in Kenya, Ivan Wamari, is leading an effort with partners in South Africa, Kenya, and Nigeria to conduct national level research on what's happening on these practices and then developing advocacy strategies. We will soon be launching a resource hub, kind of a clearinghouse for all manner of information about SOGI change efforts, how they can be combated, survivor statements, legislation examples. So that's going to be launched in a couple of weeks. So keep an eye out for that. We do have a mailing list. We're happy to sign people up. So please, we welcome interaction and contact with people.
Amazing. Yes, everyone, please get involved. And Ami, as always, thank you so much for your time and sharing your expertise with us.
Yes, my pleasure. Thank you so much, Salome.